They called it the Turbopanzer. It was a machine that didn't just bend the laws of physics, it seemed to actively despise them. In the history of human speed, there are fast cars, there are dominant cars, and then, standing alone in a terrifying category of its own, there is the Porsche 917-30. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the golden era of unregulated motorsport. If you're someone who believes that racing was better when the engineers were crazy and the safety rules were written in pencil, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing about domination. We think we want it. We watch sports hoping to see greatness, hoping to see someone or something ascend to a level that makes everyone else look amateur. We want to see Usain Bolt jogging across the finish line while everyone else is sprinting. We want to see Mike Tyson ending a fight in 90 seconds. But there is a dark side to perfection. There is a point where excellence becomes so absolute, so crushing, that it stops being a competition and starts looking like a slaughter. And when that happens, the sport itself begins to die. Now, you might be thinking, come on, isn't the point of racing to win? Well, yes, but the story we are talking about today forces us to ask a much harder question. What happens when you win too much? What happens when you build a weapon so powerful that the people running the sport have to step in and effectively ban it from existence? To understand the monster, though, you first have to understand the cage it broke out of. We need to go back to North America in the late 1960s. The cultural landscape was shifting. It was the era of Woodstock, the moon landing, in the general sense that the old rules didn't apply anymore. And in the world of motorsport, that sentiment manifested as the Canadian American Challenge Cup, or simply Can-Am. Here's what most people don't realize about Can-Am. It wasn't just a racing series. It was an engineering experiment with unlimited variables. If you look at Formula One today, or even back then, the rulebook is a thick document. It tells you exactly how big your wings can be, how much fuel you can flow, the precise dimensions of your tires, and the angle of your suspension arms. It is a box. You have to paint within the lines. Can-Am, on the other hand, was essentially a blank sheet of paper. The SCCA, which sanctioned the series, had a rulebook that was laughably thin. It basically said two things. The car must have 2 seats, and the wheels must be covered by bodywork. That was it. No limit on engine displacement, no limit on turbocharging, no limit on aerodynamics, no limit on weight. If you could build it, and you could find someone brave enough to drive it, you could race it. Look, imagine if the NFL announced tomorrow that there were no rules on performance-enhancing drugs, equipment technology, or roster sizes. Imagine if a team could field cyborgs. That was Can-Am. It was the Wild West of motorsport, a place where the wealthiest manufacturers and the maddest privateers converged to see who could build the fastest thing on 4 wheels. And for a long time, it was glorious. It was loud, dangerous, and incredibly popular. But by 1971, the series had a king, McLaren. The team founded by Bruce McLaren had turned the series into their personal playground. They had won 5 championships in a row. They were the New York Yankees of Can-Am. Their cars, powered by massive, naturally aspirated Chevrolet V8s, were essentially unbeatable. They were nicknamed the Bruce and Denny Show because Bruce McLaren and his teammate Denny Hulme won nearly every race. They were comfortable, they were confident, they thought they had solved the puzzle of Can-Am. But while McLaren was celebrating, something was stirring in Germany: Porsche. Now, we know Porsche today as a giant of the industry, a brand that sells SUVs to suburban families and precision sports cars to track day enthusiasts. But in the late 60s and early 1970s, Porsche was a company obsessed with one thing: engineering superiority. They didn't just want to win, they wanted to demonstrate technical dominance. They had conquered Le Mans with the original 917, a car that was famous for being unstable at high speeds until they fixed the aerodynamics. But endurance racing had rules. Endurance racing had limits on engine size. Porsche looked across the Atlantic at Can-Am and saw that blank sheet of paper I mentioned earlier. They saw a playground where they could unleash the full potential of their engineering department without a rulebook holding them back.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Porsche didn't just want to beat McLaren at their own game. They didn't want to build a better V8. They decided to do something that, at the time, seemed completely insane. They decided to use turbocharging on a road course. See, in the early 70s, turbo technology was crude. It was basically an on-off switch. You would put your foot down, wait 3 seconds for the exhaust gases to spin up the turbine, and then bam, you'd get hit with an explosion of power that would likely spin the car into a wall. It was fine for oval racing, where you kept the throttle pinned, but for a twisting road course like Laguna Seca or Riverside, it was considered suicide. The lag was too dangerous, the power delivery was too violent. Most engineers looked at turbocharging and said, no thanks, we'll stick with the instant throttle response of a big American V8. Porsche's engineers, sitting in their sterile offices in Weissach, looked at the same problem and said, we can fix that. This brings us to the most important partnership in the history of American racing. On one side, you had the factory might of Porsche. On the other, you had Roger Penske. If you don't know Roger Penske, think of him as the Steve Jobs of motorsport. Obsessive, meticulous, and absolutely ruthless about details. His cars were always polished. His crew wore starched shirts. His pits looked like operating rooms. Penske had a driver named Mark Donohue, and I cannot stress this enough. Mark Donohue was not a normal racing driver. Most drivers in that era were brave, instinctive, and a little bit reckless. They drove by feel. Donohue was different. He had a degree in mechanical engineering from Brown University. He was known as Captain Nice because of his polite demeanor, but behind the wheel, he was a computer. He could drive a car for 10 laps, come into the pits, and tell the mechanics exactly which spring rate needed to be changed and by how many pounds. He didn't just drive the car, he understood the physics of it in real time. When Porsche, Penske, and Donohue came together, it was the perfect storm. You had the money and technical resources of a German giant, the operational perfection of an American super team, and the driver who could translate the complex language of a turbocharged monster into engineering data. They started with the 91710 in 1972. It was a testbed. It had about 1,000 horsepower, which is already a terrifying number. It won the championship that year, breaking McLaren's streak. But for Porsche, the 91710 was just the appetizer. It was the prototype. They had learned how to make the turbo work. They had learned how to cool the massive engine. They had learned how to keep the tires attached to the pavement. And for the 1973 season, they decided to stop playing nice. They decided to build the ultimate machine, the 91730. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this car, I want you to understand the scale of what they were doing. In 1973, a standard family car had maybe 80 or 90 horsepower. A Ferrari Daytona, the supercar of the day, had about 350. Formula One cars were pushing 450. The Porsche 91730, in qualifying trim with the boost knob turned all the way to the right, this thing was capable of producing over 1,500 horsepower. Let that number sit in your brain for a second. 1,500 horsepower. That is more power than a Bugatti Veyron, a car built 30 years later with billions of dollars of VW engineering behind it. And the Bugatti weighs 2 tons and has all-wheel drive and traction control and stability management. The Porsche 91730 weighed 1,800 pounds. It had no traction control, it had no ABS, it had a manual gearbox and rear-wheel drive. Driving it wasn't just a skill, it was an act of survival. To achieve this, the engineers at Weissach took the flat 12 engine, which was essentially 2 flat 6 engines from the 911 welded together, and expanded it to 5.4 liters. Then they bolted on 2 massive Eberspacher turbochargers. Now, usually when you add big turbos to a big engine, you generate a lot of heat, like melt the pistons levels of heat. But Porsche stuck to their guns. They kept it air-cooled. While everyone else was messing around with radiators and water pumps, Porsche used a massive horizontal fan mounted on top of the engine that looked like it belonged in an industrial HVAC system. It screamed, it whined, and it kept the monster from detonating itself.
But raw power is useless if you can't use it. And this is where Mark Donohue's genius really shines through. Remember that turbo lag problem I mentioned? The engineers couldn't eliminate it entirely, physics is physics, but Donohue worked with them to manage it in a way that no one else had figured out. They developed a system of wastegates and blow-off valves that allowed the turbos to stay spun up even when the driver lifted off the throttle. Donohue also had a special dial installed in the cockpit. It was a boost controller. He could literally reach down while doing 200 miles an hour and adjust the horsepower of the engine. If he needed to save fuel, he dialed it back to a modest 1100 horsepower. If he needed to pass a McLaren, he cranked it up to 1500. It was the go fast button from a video game, made real. The chassis was just as radical. To hold all that fuel, and trust me, this thing drank fuel like a Saturn V rocket, they extended the wheelbase. The 917-30 was longer than its predecessor, which made it more stable at high speeds, but potentially clumsy in the corners. Donohue spent countless hours on the skid pad, a simple circle of asphalt, driving in circles for days, tweaking the suspension geometry, adjusting the roll bars, and fine-tuning the tire pressures. He wasn't just testing, he was data logging. In an era before digital telemetry, Donohue was the telemetry. He would come in and say, the rear breaks loose at exactly 4,000 RPM in third gear if I have 20 pounds of boost. The engineers would look at their slide rules, make a change, and send him back out. This iterative process, this endless loop of test, adjust, test, turned the car from a wild animal into a precision instrument. Here's the thing that really separates the 917-30 from everything else. It was reliable. In racing, usually the faster the car, the more fragile it is. The glass cannon archetype is real. You push an engine to the limit, it blows up. But Porsche built this thing like a tank. The transmission was reinforced to handle torque figures that would twist a normal drive shaft into a pretzel. The brakes were borrowed from their endurance racing program, designed to last 24 hours at Le Mans, so a 2-hour sprint race in Can-Am was a walk in the park for them. When the 1973 season opener arrived at motorsport in Canada, the paddock was buzzing. Everyone knew Porsche had been working on something, but no one was prepared for the reality of it. The McLarens rolled out, beautiful, orange, loud, fast. They looked like race cars. Then the 917-30 rolled out. It looked like a spaceship. It was yellow and blue, the colors of Sunoco, Penske sponsor. It was wide, flat, and possessed a rear wing that looked big enough to land a Cessna on. Qualifying began, and the stopwatch told a story before the race even started. Mark Donohue didn't just take pole position, he obliterated the field. He was seconds faster per lap. In racing, a tenth of a second is a lifetime. A full second is a different zip code. Mark Donohue was lapping fast enough to effectively be in a different time zone. The other teams, McLaren, Shadow, Lola, were in shock. They were looking at their data, looking at their engines and scratching their heads. They were running on the absolute limit of adhesion, sliding through corners, braking until the rotors glowed white hot, and Donohue would just breathe past them on the straightaway like they were standing still. The speed differential was so high it was almost comical. Now, you might be thinking, okay, it's fast in a straight line, but surely it can't corner. That was the hope of the competition. They prayed that the long wheelbase and the heavy fuel load, it carried 106 gallons of fuel, imagine the weight of that sloshing around, would make it a pig in the tight sections. But Donohue has solved that too. The aerodynamics generated so much downforce that the car was glued to the track. It didn't just accelerate, it gripped. The first race at Mosport was a declaration of war. Donohue disappeared. He didn't race the other drivers, he raced the clock. He lapped almost the entire field. The dominance was so total that it was almost boring to watch, unless you were an engineer marveling at the machine. It was like watching a grown man wrestle a toddler. But it wasn't just Mosport. It was Road Atlanta, it was Watkins Glen. Race after race, the pattern repeated. The Turbopanzer would arrive, unload, shatter the track record, win the race, and leave. At Road America, a track known for its long straights, the 917/30 hit speeds that terrified the corner workers. We're talking about approaching 240 miles per hour on the straights in 1973 on tires that were basically bias-ply balloons compared to modern rubber. The sonic boom of that flat 12 engine, followed by the whoosh of the turbos, became the soundtrack of the season. However, and this is where the story takes a turn, perfection is lonely. The fans love the speed, sure. Who doesn't love seeing a car shoot flames and break records? But sports thrive on conflict. They thrive on the question, who is going to win today? When the answer is always Mark Donohue and the Porsche, the drama evaporates. The other teams started to grumble. McLaren, who had happily dominated for 5 years, suddenly found it very unfair that someone was dominating them. They complained about the cost. We can't afford to build a turbo engine, they said. This is an arms race we can't win. And they were right. It was an arms race. But instead of bringing a better gun, they went to the sheriff. They started lobbying the SCCA. They whispered in the ears of the organizers. If you let this continue, we're going to leave. And if we leave, you have no series. This is the critical moment, the inflection point. Can-Am was faced with an existential crisis. Do we honor the spirit of the series, unlimited racing, and let Porsche reign supreme until someone smarter catches up? Or do we intervene to save the show? It's a dilemma we see in sports all the time. F1 banning active suspension, the NBA banning certain defensive zones. But in Can-Am, the intervention would be blunt force trauma. While the politics were brewing in the background, Donohue and Porsche kept winning. But there were cracks in the armor, not in the car, but in the reality of racing. At Laguna Seca, the car broke, a rare mechanical failure. At Riverside, a tire issue. These moments gave the competition a glimmer of hope, a brief respite from the beatings, but everyone knew it was luck. If the Porsche held together, it won. The season ended with Donohue securing the championship easily. The Turbopanzer had conquered America. The mission was accomplished. Porsche had proven their point. They had come to the wildest racing series on Earth, played by the no rules, and built the ultimate winner. But the backlash was coming. The winter of 1973 was going to be cold for Porsche. It wasn't a crash that killed the Porsche 917/30. It wasn't a blown engine, a tire failure, or a better competitor. It was a calculator. Welcome back to the story of the car that broke racing. We left off with Mark Donohue standing atop the podium, the undisputed king of Can-Am, while the competition stood in the paddock, covered in dust and nursing their bruised egos. The 1973 season was over, but the real battle was just beginning. And this battle wouldn't be fought on the asphalt of Riverside or Road America. It would be fought in boardroom meetings filled with smoke, coffee, and panicked organizers. Here's the thing about unlimited racing. It sounds great in theory. Run what you brung, no rules. It appeals to our primal love of freedom. But in practice, unlimited racing is a self-destruct mechanism. Eventually, someone with enough money and enough brains will build something that destroys the competitive balance. And that's exactly what Porsche had done. They had taken the prompt literally. They built the ultimate car. And in doing so, they made the show boring. The SCCA, Sports Car Club of America, was in a bind. Ticket sales were threatening to dip. Promoters were nervous. If Porsche came back in 1974 with an even faster version of the 917/30, which, knowing Porsche, they absolutely would have, there would be no point in even holding the races. Why would a fan pay $20 to watch a procession? Why would a TV network broadcast a foregone conclusion? So, the powers that be made a decision. They couldn't ban Porsche outright. That would look petty. They couldn't ban turbochargers directly without admitting that their unlimited series actually had limits. So they decided to be clever. They decided to attack the 917/30's one weakness, its thirst. The twin-turbo flat 12 engine was a marvel of engineering, but it drank fuel like a sailor on shore leave. At full boost, making 1,500 horsepower, the fuel consumption was measured in gallons per minute, not miles per gallon. The car carried huge tanks just to finish a sprint race. For the 1974 season, the SCCA introduced a fuel consumption rule. They restricted the total amount of fuel a car could use during a race. Now, on the surface, this sounded noble. It was the mid-70s, the oil crisis was looming, and efficiency was the buzzword of the day. They framed it as a move toward relevance and environmental responsibility. But let's be real. It was a hit job. It was a sniper shot aimed directly at Weissach. The math was brutal. Under the new rules, the 91730 would have to turn its boost down so significantly that it would be slower than the naturally aspirated Chevys. It would be neutered, a tiger with its teeth pulled out. Porsche ran the numbers. Mark Donohue ran the numbers. They looked at the spreadsheets, looked at the new regulations, and came to the only logical conclusion. They didn't complain. They didn't try to cheat. They simply packed their bags. Porsche announced they would not return to Can-Am for the 1974 season. Look, this moment is tragic, but it's also the ultimate compliment. Porsche built a car so dominant that the sport had to change its DNA just to get rid of them. They had won Can-Am so completely that they broke the game. But here is where the law of unintended consequences kicks in. The SCCA thought that by banning the Porsche, they would save the series. They thought the old teams, McLaren, Lola, Shadow, would come back. The racing would be close again and the fans would return. They were wrong. Without Porsche, the series lost its headline act. It lost the spectacle. And frankly, the other teams were already tired. McLaren, seeing the writing on the wall, had already shifted their focus to the Indy 500 and Formula One. The 1974 Can-Am season was a ghost town. The fields were small, the cars were slower, the energy was gone. The Shadow team won the championship that year, but it was a hollow victory. It was like winning a Super Bowl because the other team didn't show up. By the end of 1974, the original Can-Am series, the glorious, deafening, unrestricted Can-Am, was effectively dead. It limped on for a few years in different forms, but the magic was buried alongside the rules that allowed the 91730 to exist. So, what happened to the heroes of our story? The car, the 91730, didn't just go to a museum to gather dust, at least not immediately. In 1975, just to remind everyone what they were missing, Mark Donohue took the car to Talladega Superspeedway. Now, Talladega is a NASCAR track. It's a high-banked oval designed for stock cars. It is not designed for a delicate, open-top sports prototype. Donohue unleashed the beast one last time. He set a close-course world speed record, averaging 221.12 miles per hour. That is an average speed. On the straights, he was doing speeds that make modern Indy cars look sluggish. It was a final middle finger to the rule makers, a reminder of what could have been. But for Mark Donohue himself, the story takes a darker turn. And this is the part that hurts to talk about, because Donohue was truly one of the good ones. After Porsche withdrew from Can-Am, Donohue briefly retired. He had accomplished everything. He had won the Indy 500, he had won Trans Am, he had tamed the Turbopanzer. He wrote a book called The Unfair Advantage, which is still considered the Bible of racing engineering. If you haven't read it, go buy it, seriously. But racers are addicts. The adrenaline, the focus, the competition, it's a drug you can't just walk away from. When Roger Penske decided to start a Formula One team, an American team taking on the European giants, he needed a driver. He needed someone he could trust to develop the car. He called Mark. Donohue came out of retirement in 1974. He was older than the F1 grid. He was rusty, but he was Mark Donohue. He threw himself into the project with his usual obsessive intensity. But Formula One is a cruel mistress. The cars were fragile. The tracks were dangerous. On August 17, 1975, during a practice session for the Austrian Grand Prix at the Österreichring, disaster struck. A tire on Donohue's car failed at high speed. The car careened off the track, crashed through the catch fencing, and fell into a ravine. Here's the heartbreaking part. Initially, it looked like he was okay. He was conscious, he was talking to the doctors, he complained of a headache, but he seemed lucid. But a few hours later, he lapsed into a coma. The impact had caused a cerebral hemorrhage. 2 days later, Mark Donohue was dead. He was 38 years old. The racing world lost one of their brightest minds. Porsche lost their greatest translator, and we, the fans, lost the chance to see what else he could have engineered. But while the man was gone, the legacy of the machine he helped build lived on. The DNA of the 91730 didn't die with Can-Am. The lessons Porsche learned, how to cool a massive turbo engine, how to manage boost, how to make aerodynamic downforce work with high horsepower, went straight back to Germany. Those lessons were applied to the Porsche 937, a car that would go on to terrorize sports car racing in the late 70s. They were applied to the Porsche 956 and 962, the Group C monsters that would own Le Mans in the 1980s. When you look at a modern Porsche 911 Turbo S with its variable geometry turbos and its effortless speed, you are looking at the great-grandchild of the 91730. The Turbopanzer was a martyr. It died so that turbocharging could live. Before the 91730, turbochargers were seen as a gimmick, something for trucks or airplanes. After the 91730, everyone knew, if you want to go fast, really fast, you need forced induction. This is where it gets really interesting. We often look at banned cars as failures. We think, oh, they broke the rules so they got kicked out. But in the case of the 91730, getting banned was the ultimate victory. It means you won the game so hard that the developers had to patch it. It stands as a monument to a specific moment in time, a brief, shining window where the engineers were allowed to dream without limits. Most people don't realize that the 91730 is actually quite rare. Porsche only built a handful of chassis. Today, they are priceless. If one comes up for auction, you need the GDP of a small country to buy it. But their value isn't just in the metal and the rubber. It's in the story. It's the story of what happens when you remove the guardrails. It's the story of what humans can create when you tell them, go as fast as you can. And that leads us to the final question. The question that hangs over every race series today. Are we better off with the rules? Sure, modern racing is safer, the cars are closer, the championships are decided by points, not by seconds per lap. But is it as exciting? Is there anything on the grid today that makes you feel the way the 91730 made people feel in 1973? Is there anything that feels like a monster? Maybe that's why we are still talking about this car 50 years later. Because deep down, we miss the monsters. We miss the feeling of awe. We miss the days when a car could be so fast it was considered unfair. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is a great story about one specific car, but why does that matter today? And that is a fair question. Why should we care about a gas-guzzling dinosaur from 1973? Here's the thing. The 91730 isn't just a car. It is the perfect embodiment of a philosophy that has defined the greatest moments in human competition. It is the physical manifestation of what Mark Donohue called the unfair advantage. In his book, Donohue argued that in racing, you are not looking for a fair fight. If you find yourself in a fair fight, you have failed as an engineer. You're looking for an advantage so distinct, so overwhelming, that the result is decided before the green flag even drops. This philosophy is uncomfortable for us. We're raised on the idea of sportsmanship. We're taught that winning is about trying your best, and that everyone should have an equal shot. But motorsport, real bleeding-edge motorsport, is not a democracy. It is a meritocracy of intelligence. When we look back at history, the cars we remember, the one that we make posters of, are never the ones that won a close championship by a few points. They're the ones that broke the game. We remember the Brabham BT46B fan car, which used a massive fan to suck the car to the ground, generating so much grip it was banned after one race. We remember the Group B rally cars of the 1980s, which became so fast and dangerous that the FIA had to shut down the entire category to stop drivers from dying. We remember the Williams FW14B from 1992, which had active suspension so advanced that Nigel Mansell could essentially drive circles around Ayrton Senna. The 91730 sits at the very top of this pyramid. It is the grandfather of the banned for being too good club. And there's something deeply attractive about that. It appeals to the part of our brain that loves the outlaw, the part of us that wants to see what happens when someone refuses to compromise. But there is a flip side to this coin. And this is where it gets really interesting. While the fans love the outlaw, the organizers, the people who actually run the sport, are in the business of entertainment. And entertainment requires uncertainty. If you know the ending of a movie before it starts, you probably won't buy a ticket. This creates a fundamental tension that exists in every form of racing to this day. The sport versus the show. The engineers represent the sport. Their job is to be faster, period. If being faster means ruining the show, so be it. The organizers represent the show. Their job is to keep you watching. In 1973, the Porsche 917-30 proved that if you let the engineers win, they will eventually kill the show. They will solve the equation of speed so effectively that there's no drama left. This is why we have balance of performance, BOP, today. This is why modern race cars are restricted. We live in a world that the 917-30 created. Every time you hear a fan complain about too many regulations in F1 or artificial restrictions in Le Mans, they are unknowingly referencing the ghost of the 917-30. We regulate because we are afraid of another Mark Donohue showing up and making everyone else look silly. Look, I want to pivot for a second. We've talked about the racing, the politics, and the philosophy, but we need to talk about the metal, because the technical legacy of this car is arguably more important than its racing record. Most people don't realize that before the 917-30, turbocharging was considered a dark art. It was unreliable. It was for diesel trucks or aircraft engines. Ferrari didn't touch it. They stuck to their high-revving V12s. American manufacturers stuck to their massive displacement V8s. Porsche was the only one brave enough, or crazy enough, to bet the farm on forced induction for road racing. And because they were forced to solve the problems of the 917-30, they accelerated the development of turbo technology by a decade. Think about the problems they had to solve. Problem 1, heat. Turbos get hot. Solution? Advanced metallurgy and massive intercooling. Though on the 917-30, the intercooling was mostly just shoving as much air as possible over the engine. Problem 2? Lag. Solution? The wastegate systems and bypass valves we discussed earlier. Problem 3? Drivability. Solution? Developing a chassis that could communicate with the driver even when the power spiked. Once Porsche solved these issues on the track, they didn't just file the blueprints away. They immediately applied them to their road cars. The Porsche 911 Turbo, the 930, was released in 1975, right after the 917-30 was banned. It was the first production sports car to really make turbocharging famous. It was dangerous, sure. It was nicknamed the Widowmaker, but it was fast, and it used the exact same technology that Donohue used to destroy Can-Am. From there, the technology trickled down. It went to the 924, the 944, and eventually to almost every car on the road today. Look at the modern automotive landscape. Ford EcoBoost, turbo. Honda Civic, turbo. Ferrari 488, turbo. We live in the age of the turbocharger, and we live here because 50 years ago, a group of Germans and an American engineer decided to strap two massive hair dryers to a flat 12 engine and see what happened. The 917-30 was the proof of concept for the modern performance engine. Now, you might be thinking, wait, are you saying my Ford F-150 is related to a 1,500 horsepower race car? In a way, yes. The fundamental principles of managing boost pressure, of fuel delivery under load, of thermal management, those were stress tested to the absolute limit in the crucible of Can-Am. This is the beauty of racing. It's a high-speed laboratory. When things break on a race car, engineers learn, and what they learn eventually makes your commute better, faster, or more efficient. The 917-30 was the ultimate laboratory because it was the most extreme environment. If a part could survive 1,500 horsepower at Riverside, it could survive your trip to the grocery store. But let's get back to the story, because there is one more layer to peel back. We talked about Mark Donohue, we talked about the car, but we haven't talked enough about the team owner, Roger Penske. If you follow racing today, you know the captain. Roger Penske owns the IndyCar Series. He owns the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. His team has won the Indy 500 nearly 20 times. He's the titan of American motorsport.
The 1973 Can-Am season was the moment Roger Penske solidified his reputation. Before this, he was a successful racer and a smart team owner, but the 9/17/30 campaign proved that he could operate on a global level. He could partner with a foreign manufacturer, Porsche, integrate their technology, and manage a complex political environment. The level of professionalism Penske brought to Can-Am was unheard of. While other teams were showing up in jeans and t-shirts, wrenching on cars in the dirt, Penske's team had polished floors. They had matching uniforms. They had a level of discipline that intimidated the opposition before the engines were even fired. There's a famous story that Donohue would spend hours polishing the underside of the car. Not the top, the underside, the part nobody sees. Why? Because if you are cleaning the underside, you might spot a loose bolt or a stress fracture that you would otherwise miss. That is the Penske way, and that attention to detail is what allowed them to harness the chaos of 1,500 horsepower. So when you look at the 9/17/30, don't just see a fast car. See the birth of the modern super team. See the moment when racing transitioned from a hobby for rich adrenaline junkies into a multi-million-dollar business of precision engineering. It was the end of the garagista era, the guys building cars in sheds, and the beginning of the corporate technological warfare era. And like any transition, it was painful. It claimed the life of the series, Can-Am. It claimed the life of the driver, Donohue. But it birthed the modern world of speed. And this brings us to a somewhat uncomfortable truth. We love the underdog stories. We love Ford versus Ferrari, where the plucky Americans take on the establishment. But the story of the 9/17/30 is the opposite. It is a story of the overdog. It is a story of the empire striking back. Porsche and Penske were not the underdogs. They were the best funded, smartest, most prepared team on the grid. They were the Death Star, and they blew up Alderaan. And usually in movies, we root for the rebels to blow up the Death Star. But in engineering, we have to respect the Death Star, because the Death Star worked. It did exactly what it was designed to do. It projected power so absolute that resistance became futile. When you walk up to a Porsche 9/17/30 today, and you can find one in the Porsche Museum in Stuttgart or occasionally at a high-end Concours d'Elegance, it looks deceptively simple. It doesn't look like a computer. It doesn't look like the spaceship I described earlier. It looks like a bathtub with wheels. The bodywork is smooth, lacking the intricate winglets and jagged edges of a modern Formula One car. The cockpit is sparse. There's a steering wheel, a gear shifter, and a few analog gauges that look like they were stolen from a World War II fighter plane. There's no screen. There's no radio button. There's just a tachometer, a boost gauge, and a seat that offers about as much protection as a cardboard box. Sitting in it, even while it's parked, feels eerie. You realize that a human being, a father, a husband, a friend, strapped himself into this aluminum tub, surrounded by 100 gallons of high-octane fuel, and voluntarily propelled himself to 240 miles per hour. It reminds you that the unfair advantage wasn't just the turbochargers, it was the courage. Here's the thing that haunts me, and it might haunt you too if you think about it long enough. We often ask, what if? What if the SCCA hadn't panicked? What if they had let the 1974 season proceed without the fuel restrictions? If Porsche had been allowed to continue development, where would we have ended up? The engineers were already talking about 2,000 horsepower. They were experimenting with active aerodynamics long before it was legal in F1. They were looking into continuously variable transmissions, or CVTs, to keep the engine at peak boost constantly. We might have seen a golden age of technology that would have accelerated automotive history by 20 years. Or we might have seen tragedy. Perhaps the cars would have become too fast for the tracks. Perhaps the tires couldn't have kept up. Perhaps the human body couldn't have sustained the G-forces. In a way, the band saved us from finding out the answer to that dark question. It froze to 9/17/30 in time as the ultimate what if. It remains the peak of a mountain we are no longer allowed to climb. It took Porsche nearly 45 years to build something that spiritually succeeded the 9/17/30.
In 2018, they released the 919 Hybrid Evo. It was a modified version of their Le Mans winner stripped of all regulations. No fuel limits, no headlight requirements, massive active aerodynamics. They took it to the Nürburgring and smashed the lap record doing a 5:19.55. When you watch the onboard footage of that lap, it looks like the video is sped up. It defies belief. But that car, the 919 Evo, is a direct descendant of the 917-30. It exists for the same reason, to show the world what happens when Porsche takes the gloves off. It was a tribute to the philosophy of Mark Donohue. But there is a difference. The 919 Evo was a marketing stunt, a victory lap. The 917-30 was a weapon of war. It was built to kill a series, and it succeeded. So, how do we sum up the legacy of the Porsche 917-30? It is a story of excess. It is a story of a time when too much was just enough. It is a story that proves that in the pursuit of perfection, you will eventually find yourself alone. Porsche climbed to the top of the mountain, looked around, and realized they had killed everyone else on the way up. There's a lesson here for all of us, whether you are an engineer, a creative, or just someone trying to be the best at what you do. Excellence is disruptive. True innovation doesn't just improve the status quo, it destroys it. And when you destroy the status quo, people will get angry. They will change the rules. They will try to slow you down. Mark Donohue didn't care. Roger Penske didn't care. They just wanted to win. And they did. They won so hard that 50 years later, we are still making videos about it. We are still analyzing the spring rates and the boost pressures. We are still trying to understand the magic. This is legacy motoring. We tell these stories because they matter. We tell them because the 917-30 isn't just a collection of parts, it is a monument to human ambition. It is a reminder that the only true limits are the laws of physics, and even those can be negotiated if you have enough horsepower. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the car that killed Can-Am, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. We have some incredible stories coming up. Stories about the banned rally cars of the 80s, the six-wheeled F1 cars, and the engines that were too loud for TV. Leave a comment below and tell me, do you think the SCCA was right to ban the 917-30, or should they have let the monsters run free until they exploded? I read every comment, and I really want to know your take on the sport versus show debate. Thank you for watching. Thank you for respecting the history. And remember, if you're going to build a car, don't just build it to win, build it to change the rules. I'll see you in the next one. Drive safe or drive fast. Just don't drive boring.